If you've played video games recently, you've likely heard of Gacha Games, a genre of game where the main gameplay loop is based around the act of randomly acquiring characters, items, cosmetics, etc. through a system that works similarly to Japanese gachapon machines. Opinions on this style of game vary across the video game community, but one question does loom over all discussion of these games in the present day. That question being, what is the best gacha game? Or at least, what ones should I invest my time and money in? And to attempt to answer that question is me. Hi, I'm SkylaWuzHere, mostly known as Skyla, and I have played far too many gacha games in my life, and so I set out to play and rank every gacha game I can, all in the hopes of determining which game reigns supreme and which ones may best be avoided. My ranking system is quite simple, as I've divided the important aspects of gacha games into 3 criteria, in which I gave each game a ranking from 0 to 10, with 0 being the worst possible score and 10 being the highest. Those criteria are gameplay, story, and gambling. The gameplay score is determined by how enjoyable the actual game mechanics are to play. Story is how interesting and well written in the story and lore of the game is, as well as how it's presented to the player. And gambling is both a measure of how rewarding the random gacha mechanics are and how punishing and or fair said mechanics are. I am attempting to be as unbiased as possible, and I've not played each game for equal amounts of time. So if a game gets better after X amount of hours or after X version, I will likely not know that fact. If you disagree with any of these ratings, or if I got anything wrong, leave a comment telling me what I did wrong and I might care, or I might not, who knows. Also, every game mentioned in this video is free to play, and I'm saying that now so I don't need to repeat it for every single game. Also, a minor note, the third score is gambling, but I will mistakenly refer to it as gacha repeatedly throughout this video because I made a mistake when writing this script, and am only now realizing it when actually recording the intro. So, just a note there. With all that said, let's get right into it with the first game alphabetically, which also happens to be a game I've played for almost a year now. Arknights is a tactical tower defense game for mobile platforms developed by Hypergriff and originally released in 2019. Arknights takes place in a dystopian apocalyptic setting where material known as Originum has both provided many valuable advancements, but also caused the disease Oropathy, which can be extremely fatal if it progresses far enough. You play as a leader within the pharmaceutical company in Rhodes Islands, which seeks to find a cure for Oropathy. The primary gameplay of Arknights is the tower defense, where you use your various operators to prevent enemies from getting from point A to point B. However, the game can be extremely difficult at points, because some levels restrict the operators you can use, and or will add other gameplay restrictions, making it basically a puzzle game at some points. The abilities of the operators you can get, as well as the general gameplay loop, is unique and fairly satisfying, especially when you finally built a team well enough to finish that one level you've been stuck on for ages. So for that, I'm giving Arknights an 8 out of 10 for gameplay, starting it off strong. The overarching story and world of Arknights portrays a setting in which anarchists, organizations, and the common criminal all fight to survive and hope that Oropathy does not take their lives. Arknights has a lot of operators with distinct and interesting personalities, as well as amazing character designs from loads of talented artists. And from what I'm aware of from both my own experience playing the game, and from what I hear about story elements from friends who are much further in the game, I could safely give Arknights a 7 out of 10 for story. And the gacha. The gacha in Arknights is based around obtaining characters known as operators, which are what you use to actually play the game. Most of the gacha systems are above average for the genre, with none being distinctly over-greedy or over-generous. So with that in mind, I give Arknights a 6 out of 10 in gacha, which is not a bad score in any regard, which takes Arknights to a total score of 21 out of a possible 30, which is very respectable overall. Next up is Azure Lane, which I only started playing recently. Azure Lane is a side-scrolling shoot-'em-up mobile game developed by Shanghai Manju and Xiamen Yongxi, and was released back in 2017. The entire game is based on an alternate history of World War II, where you use battleships that are also anime women to fight other ship girls. Admittedly, I only decided to try out the game due to the now concluded collaboration with the Data Life franchise, and disregarding my own opinions on the designs for that collaboration, and I have a lot of opinions about those designs, it was an effective hook to get me to try the game. The gameplay side of Azure Lane is fairly basic in terms of how you actually play the game, as it's basically just a side-scrolling bullet hell where you attempt to dodge enemy fire while occasionally pressing your ability buttons. There's a decent amount of customization you can do to how your ship girls are statted, but I'm not far enough into the game to see if the inevitable best build for X character trend almost every gacha game has will make the customization in Azure Lane less interesting. You do get to add cats to the command structure of your fleets, so that's quite charming. But overall, Azure Lane gets a 6 out of 10 for gameplay. I don't have much to say about the story of Azure Lane, as it's fairly basic and feels like a generic housing for gameplay and characters, and that's about it. I've seen hints of interesting world building and such, but so far I would have to give it an average score of 5 out of 10 for story, and we'll just move right along onto gacha. The gacha mechanics in Azure Lane are actually kinda unique, as you need to build your ship girls and wait for them to finish construction before you can actually obtain them. There are items to instantly finish construction, obviously, and with a large variety of ship girls added, there's bound to be many characters you like. However, with the limit on how many ship girls you can own, it's quite obnoxious to repeatedly retire your duplicate ship girls, just to then acquire more duplicates from building. With that said, Azure Lane gets a 6 out of 10 for gacha, as it's fairly average but contains a few unique aspects that puts it ahead slightly, giving Azure Lane an overall score of 17 out of 30, which is slightly above average, which is about how I describe Azure Lane as a whole. Our next gacha is Data Live Spirit Pledge. No, wait, that's not right. Data Live Spirit Crisis. Nope, that's not it either. What was it again? Ah, right. Data Live Spirit Echo is a gacha game based on the aforementioned franchise Data Live that was released for mobile in 2025 by HK Admo Tech Limited. And you know what? I'm just gonna be very blunt with this one. Spirit Echo is a blatant ripoff of the prior existing Spirit Pledge and Spirit Crisis Data Live games, to the point where the original developers of Spirit Pledge, Hot Games' splash screen still shows up when you launch the game. The current developers simply took the original version of Spirit Pledge and then added some of the newer characters in the franchise and are rerunning old events and adding some very strange additions, like pets. I don't really know if that was a thing towards the end of the run of Spirit Crisis, but it's just very not fitting in the franchise in general. This is exceptionally evident due to the fact that some of the items belonging to now removed collaboration characters still exist within the game for some reason. And while I personally enjoyed playing Spirit Pledge a few years back, the current version feels nothing more than a cash grab using the old game files. But in the sake of fairness, I must review it like the other games. The gameplay of Spirit Echo is a fairly standard beat-em-up style game that requires you to utilize characters from the Data Life franchise to defeat various enemies and progress through the original story of Data Life. Most of the gameplay is fairly basic, with the main downside being that some of the characters are objectively better than others without any contest. And it does not feel good knowing that your favorite characters will just stop being viable as you get farther into the game. So with that, I give Spirit Echo the below average score of 4 out of 10, which, spoilers, is the highest score it'll get in this video. Let's get the last two scores out of the way quickly, because they're the exact same and I really want to stop talking about this game. The story of Spirit Echo is the story of Data Life with very little alterations. There's the dating sim aspect to the game that does have some interesting character bits, but overall it's nothing interesting or unique, and a lot of them are just copy and paste from the full-fledged Data Live dating sim games. And the gacha mechanics are really greedy, with no carried over pity of any kind between banners, and the chances of getting the rate-up character are exceptionally low. And because the game is very stingy on giving out the currency used for the gachas, it's very hard to get your desired characters without forking out real money for them. So with that, I give Spirit Echo a 3 out of 10 for both story and gacha, giving it an overall score of 10. Which I do feel somewhat bad about, but as I said, I would be very honest with this one, and I played Spirit Echo for the nostalgia I had for Spirit Pledge, as it was my first ever gacha game to my knowledge. But now that that nostalgia has faded, I realize just how terrible the game is, especially as something that was just stolen and relaunched with no changes. Next is what is the second most played game of all time, Genshin Impact. I must first admit that this is the game I have the most playtime in on this list, and so it will likely have some bias, although that will likely be a better reflection of the game as a whole, considering that I have played it so long. With that said, Genshin Impact is an open-world action RPG developed by MiHoYo and released in 2020, and is now on various platforms such as PC, mobile, PlayStation, and Xbox. Genshin Impact takes place in a world of 7 elements with nations governed by the god of their respective element, and the game is focused on adventuring from nation to nation in search of your past, all the while helping those in need during your adventure. The combat of Genshin Impact is primarily based around using the elements together to generate elemental reactions, which can deal damage, weaken enemies, and generate shields for your team. Some at the same time. And as the game has progressed throughout the years, the elemental reactions have advanced significantly, and with a large variety of characters, there's also a lot of potential for you to make a team with most characters, although some characters are better suited to certain teams or to work with specific elemental reactions. Throughout the world of Genshin Impact, there's a variety of enemies, puzzles, and quests that keep the gameplay varied and interesting. And because of that, I'm giving Genshin Impact a 8 out of 10 for gameplay, because while certain aspects of the game are not super unique, they do come together for a good experience overall. This is the part I will very easily admit I am very biased on, because I believe the overarching story of Genshin Impact is very, very good. The only downside is that the first couple nations are kinda rough, as the game was very much still finding its legs. However, that does not take away from the vast array of colorful characters and story that filled the game. And so if you're someone who loves to delve into the lore and characters of games you play, Genshin Impact is a perfect game for you. And so I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 for story. And finally for gacha. Genshin Impact somewhat set the standard for gacha games due to its popularity and widespread success. The gacha system is quite straightforward, and while many in the Genshin community complain about not getting enough currency for pulls, a lot of those same people will actively complain about needing to actually play the game to get currency. So take that opinion with a bowl of salt. In my opinion, if you're willing to devote the time to the game and are smart with how you use the currency, you can easily get the pulls you need to get the characters you want when they show up, or for when they show up again in their reruns. So for that, I give Genshin Impact an 8 out of 10 for gacha, giving it an overall score of 24 out of 30, which is our highest score so far. Let's see if we can beat it, shall we? Next up to bat is Honkai Star Rail, a game I played for a while and then dropped due to no longer having the time or mental energy to juggle it along with Genshin Impact at once. Honkai Star Rail is a turn-based RPG developed by MiHoYo that was released for mobile, PC, and some consoles in 2023. That takes you on a journey through the stars to strange planets and space stations that are all based around the reverence for the godlike aeons that represent the different types of character abilities. And if that part sounds familiar, it's because Star Rail clearly took inspiration from its successful predecessor, Genshin Impact. And that's not exactly a bad thing, I just felt that it was worth pointing out. The gameplay of Star Rail is primarily that of a turn-based RPG, with the exception to the turn-based nature being that some character abilities are able to be used when it's not their turn, like ultimates and follow-up attacks. The variety of characters and builds keeps the gameplay fairly fresh, with one of the main gameplay loops being based around a roguelike known as the Simulated Universe. However, the Simulated Universe is very tied to how you build your characters, requiring you to do long runs of this roguelike just to have a chance to roll on the specific Simulated Universe's relic pool for a chance to get one that actually works for one of your characters. And unfortunately, that's not the main issue I have with Star Rail's gameplay loop. While most of the gameplay loop is fun, especially with the auto battle feature allowing you to automatically repeat certain things you've done before so you can grind for character materials, the issue with the game's gameplay comes from the absurd power creep that started to become apparent in version 2.0. If you're not aware, power creep is a term used in media where some aspect of the media is continuing to ramp up to a point where it's clear that characters introduced earlier in the story cannot hope to face the threats presented later on. In Star Rail, the primary issue is the way HP and mechanics of enemies have evolved over the development of the game, as many characters released in the early versions are no longer able to keep up with modern enemies. Meaning that, in many cases, it's more worth it to attempt to acquire the latest characters instead of building up the strengths of the ones you got earlier. Which isn't as much of an issue for new players as it is for players who have been playing since the beginning. And while the developers have attempted to strengthen certain early characters, an example of this being the change of the primary stat Jingliu scales off of, that is not a fix for every character, unfortunately. So while the gameplay is fun, it is quite annoying to have to constantly get new characters to make teams when you've only just finished the extensive grind to make your old team somewhat viable. So for that, I'm giving Honkai Star Rail a 6 out of 10 for gameplay. Still above average, but much lower than it could have been had the scaling issues not been so grossly apparent. Now with my major issue with Star Rail out of the way, let's get to the game's most redeeming qualities: its story and gacha mechanics. The story of Star Rail starts out fairly simple, however as you progress the writing of the main story continues to improve in quality and depth, and by the time you get to the world of Penacony, the story and characters are so compelling, in my opinion obviously, that the main story actually made me cry at multiple points throughout it. And from what I've heard, it does not slow down in quality in the more recent story quests either. So for that, I'm giving Star Rail's 8 out of 10 for story, as I was continuing to treasure my feelings during specific moments I felt during that story for a long time. The gacha aspect of Star Rail is pretty much the same as Genshin Impact, however there are few aspects that are improvements that other games could afford to copy. Things like now being able to change the characters you can lose your 50/50s to, and straight up giving the player multiple decent 5-star characters, which helps considerably with progression. So for that, I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 for gacha, although if I had to allowed for decimal points, it would have been something like an 8.7 out of 10. But since that's not how this works, Honkai Star Rail has a good overarching score of 22 out of 30. Next up on the chopping block is Limbus Company, a 2023 turn-based RPG by Project Moon, released on PC and mobile. Limbus Company is technically a sequel game to Project Moon's prior games, Lobotomy Corporation and Library of Ruina. However, it can easily be played without any prior knowledge of those games. Although, in my personal opinion, having prior knowledge of the setting in the game does increase the overall enjoyment of Limbus Company quite a bit. The game follows a rowdy group of individuals known as the Sinners, as they try to delve into decrepit Lobotomy Corporation branches to find the treasures within. The gameplay of Limbus Company revolves around using a unique turn-based combat system that involves the Sinners using identities based on the other characters in the story to assume their fighting capabilities. In addition to using the ego of the monstrous abnormalities to gain even more combat strength. Limbus Company's primary gameplay loop outside of story progression is based around a roguelike system where you fight through Lobotomy Corporation branches as well as other gameplay locations, acquiring items that help you with a build to obtain the currency used for pulls on the completion of the roguelike. The main thing that the gameplay of Limbus Company has going for it above other gacha games is that the characters don't need extensive amounts of equipment with random stats that you need to perfect in order for them to be viable. Instead, the only thing you need to worry about is making sure your team has good synergy, and that's it. Which makes Limbus Company a lot easier to play and wrap your head around, as well as significantly reduces the sheer amount of obnoxious grinding that many gacha games thrive from. However, the gameplay style of Limbus Company does get somewhat dull after a while in my opinion, and all this culminates in a 7 out of 10 for gameplay, which is very good, especially with its other scores. The story of Limbus Company has a very clear rhythm it sticks to, but that rhythm works quite well, as the general rule is that each chapter of the story will focus on one specific sinner and their backstory, while the main plot progresses along with them. And if you like horror and seeing a bunch of messed up people come into their own and get over their issues, then the story of Limbus Company is for you. Which gives Limbus Company 8 out of 10 for story, and I can't really elaborate much more without spoiling it. And the gacha system in Limbus Company is fairly simple. You pull for identities and egos, and once you have a copy of one type of them, you never need to get duplicates for them or for any other reason. And that, combined with generally more forgiving rates for getting characters, the expression that Limbus Company is a gacha game made by people who don't know anything about the genre is very accurate. And that gives it a 9 out of 10 for gacha, as it's very fair and you don't need to get excessive amounts of pulls to get a decent team together, landing Limbus Company with an overall score of 24 out of 30. Let's turn back the clock in a manner of speaking and move on to the next game, Reverse 1999. Reverse 1999 is a tactical turn-based RPG developed by Bluepock that was released in 2023 on mobile and later on PC. Reverse 1999 takes place in an alternate reality of the 20th century, as a terrifying phenomenon known as the Storm somehow makes time go backwards, causing our cast to jump back through eras of history. Reverse 1999 does a lot of things right in my books, but one thing I instantly fell in love with are the character designs and voice acting, because Bluepock have managed to assemble an English voice cast that does not just sound like very generic Americans, which is extremely impressive in its own right. Not to discount the voice talent of other games on this list, but having a game based on Earth and actually having characters speak with their own accents and with parts of their native language helps sell this world of Reverse 1999 quite heavily. The gameplay of Reverse 1999 is a fairly simple yet strangely intricate turn-based card battler with some unique mechanics that relate to where in your hand your cards are and how they interact with each other. Admittedly, I've not gotten super far into the story of Reverse 1999, so I'm not sure if the combat gets tedious or very difficult, but so far I've had a lot of fun with it, and with the other bits of gameplay like the hex-based customizable wilderness that I got obsessed with instantly, I can safely give Reverse 1999 an 8 out of 10 for gameplay, because its gameplay is legitimately enjoyable, and even if you're not super into it, it has an auto battle feature so you can just focus on the parts you like. And now I'm gonna pull a reverse and switch up the order for a reason you'll see in a moment. The gacha systems of Reverse 1999 are fairly standard nowadays, where you build up pity to get your higher characters and whatnot, but overall the odds are balanced, and I believe pity carries over between banners, so that helps a lot. So because of that, it gets a 7 out of 10 for gacha, and we'll just move on to the best part of Reverse 1999, the story. In the story of Reverse 1999, you play as the Timekeeper, an individual who observes the time-reversing storms and searches for answers as to why they start to happen and if they can be stopped. The story is well written with compelling characters that all feel unique and that they have a reason to exist as part of the story beyond just pretty faces to pull for in the gacha. With the story tackling heavy concepts and topics at points, and is not afraid to pull the wool over your eyes for plot reveals that many games would chicken out on committing to. And while it's possible that the story gets worse later on, as I've only gotten to chapter 4 of the story, so far it does one thing well that most other games on this list did poorly, which is start the story off with high quality writing and characters without requiring multiple real-life years of updates to have the story get good. So with that said, I give Reverse 1999 the first and only perfect score on one of its criteria, with a 10 out of 10 on story, landing Reverse 1999 at a total score of 25 out of 30, the highest score so far. So let's see if any of the remaining games can beat that, shall we? Hey, so have you ever wondered what would happen if you took horse racing and threw it in a blender with anime? No? Well, too bad! Games did, and now we have Uma Musume Pretty Derby, an originally mobile game released back in 2021 in Japan, and then later in 2025 it was released globally on mobile and PC, and took the internet by storm. Uma Musume can be best described as a roguelike horse racing gacha game, where you play through the careers of your horse girls as their trainer and help them achieve their goals and win races. And it's oddly addicting in a very strange way that's, like, almost impossible to describe. The gameplay of Uma Musume is very repetitive, with every aspect of the game simply being built around the careers gameplay loop, with events even just requiring you to complete careers for rewards and such. You using the horse girls and support cards you get from the gacha and the careers to advance, and a surprisingly advanced stat system. Uma Musume has a lot for those who are willing to spend the time to learn its mechanics. And speaking of time, these careers take a long time each, even if you're just skipping through all the dialogue and choices. And considering the game expects you to do multiple per day to use up your stamina, that means that it is a significant time investment to play the game, which is not everyone's cup of tea, and is certainly why I stopped playing it. So with that said, I give Uma Musume Pretty Derby a 7 out of 10 for gameplay, because it is fun, but the time-consuming aspect takes it down quite a few notches. Let's wrap this score up quickly as there's not much to say. The story of Uma Musume Pretty Derby is pretty simple, as it's mostly just inspired by the real-life racehorses the characters are based on, and the parts that aren't are somewhat generic school life, slice of life stories based on racing. Overall, the anime does a considerably better job at telling Uma Musume stories than the game does, leaving the game at a 5 out of 10 for its unfortunately average story. Meanwhile, the gacha aspect is odd. It's both forgiving and unforgiving at the same time, depending on your playstyle. Because if you're just saving up to get characters and support cards you like, you'll be fine. However, if you want to be competitive, then it's much harder to keep up with your horse girls and support cards, as both generally need you to get multiple copies of in order to make them competitively viable. But there's a silver lining. It's that when a banner for a character or support card is over, they simply just enter the pool of characters you can randomly obtain from pulling on any banner, meaning that once a banner ends, you still have a chance to pull them later on randomly. With all that said, Uma Musume Pretty Derby gets a 7 out of 10 for gacha, landing it at a 19 out of 30 for overall score. Our second to last game is Wuthering Waves, released in 2024 by Gacha Games on mobile, PC, and PS5. Wuthering Waves is an open-world RPG that is clearly heavily inspired by Genshin Impact, as many gameplay mechanics are directly lifted from it and other MiHoYo games, which isn't in itself a bad thing, but I'll get into it more later. The game is focused around exploring the world, completing quests, and grinding for materials to build up your characters. I have to be perfectly honest, I'm not a fan of Wuthering Waves personally. I feel as though all the hype around it was built solely on the idea of having another game that can be in direct competition with Genshin Impact, and all the conversation I see about the game online is just about how much better it is than other games, without actually elaborating what exactly Wuthering Waves does that's better than the games that came before and after. In my opinion, the gameplay style of faster paced, slightly more tactical combat can be fun originally, however it does not feel as unique as people talk it up to be. The open world has always felt kinda lifeless. Like, there is stuff in it, but none of it felt like anything more than vessels for collecting materials and leveling up your characters. Which I think is the best way I can describe my experience with Wuthering Waves. It just felt hollow. I'm not sure if it improved over the time since I stopped playing, but nothing about its gameplay made me want to play it over any other game I was currently playing. So with that said, I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 for gameplay, because while it does do some unique stuff, it really just feels like it's lifting the most popular mechanics from loads of other games and throwing them together with little to no synergy. The story of Wuthering Waves also just felt clunky. Starting the game feels like you're reading the 100-page world lore document before starting a Dungeons & Dragons campaign, where it is just overwhelming and does not give you a good reason to be invested in the world nor the characters, as the entire story from what I've experienced is mostly just comprised of go here and talk to this person and then go there and talk to them, which isn't bad per se, and it's certainly not something that isn't shared between other games on this list, but it's not really the style you want to start out with an open world game like this. So I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 for story, and we're moving on. The gacha aspect is better than average, however it's nothing unusual for the genre. The character designs are good, and how they play is interesting, but nothing about the gacha systems in Wuthering Waves really stood out as exceptional. So I'm giving it a 7 out of 10 for being better than the average cash grab gacha game, but not doing anything unique. which is a good summary of its total score of 19 out of 30. Not bad, but not anything groundbreaking or unique. So if you just want a decent game all around, then Wuthering Waves is good for you. But that's about all it is from my experience. And now we're at the final game of the video. Zenless Zone Zero is a hack-and-slash RPG developed by MiHoYo and released on PC, mobile, and PS5 in 2024, and was later ported to Xbox in 2025. While it might not be entirely accurate to call Zenless Zone Zero a hack-and-slash game, to me personally that feels like the best descriptor, as the gameplay is built around being extremely fast-paced from the start, which is really what makes it very addicting for me personally. The rough plot of the game is you play as two siblings who assist various people in a very apocalyptic setting that has areas of the world suddenly getting covered in spheres known as hollows that makes the whole areas unlivable. The gameplay of Zenless Zone Zero is fast-paced and, if you've built your team right, very addicting to just rush through combat with pretty visuals and unique character abilities and builds. It also has various roguelike and other elements for keeping players engaged. But in my experience, they get somewhat dull after a while. Somewhat like Honkai Star Rail, Zenless Zone Zero suffers from having a gameplay loop that is very repetitive, and despite combat being very fast, it does not feel like it when you're doing it over and over and over again just to grind for a character or to get currencies per pulse. So I'm giving it an 8 out of 10 for gameplay because the gameplay is fun, it just is really bogged down by the rest of the game. With that said, the story of Zenless Zone Zero is decent. It's about the quality I expect from MiHoYo games nowadays, but in my opinion it suffers early on from excessive filler content, as there is just loads of random story quests that don't feel like they add anything to the overarching plot, but you still need to do them in between the main story quests. So I'm giving it a 6 out of 10 for story because it's alright with some standout moments, but the plot just lost me after a while. And I can also wrap up the gacha score really quickly, as it's about the average gacha system of MiHoYo games, and as far as I've seen, it doesn't do anything that really stands out. The main thing that does stand out is the sheer amount of luck I've had pulling for characters, but I think that's just chance and not a reflection of the systems themselves. Meaning that Zenless Zone Zero gets a 7 out of 10 for gacha, leaving it with a final score of 21 out of 30, which is better than average, but mostly carried by the gameplay. And now that we've covered all the games I could for this video, I wanted to say that there was a few games I wanted to cover, but had to cut because I did not have the time to try them out enough to form a solid opinion on them. So if you enjoyed this video, like, subscribe, leave a comment if you want part 2, because I know for certain I can easily assemble an even more unhinged list of games to cover for part 2. With that said, the verdict of this video is that Reverse 1999 is the best gacha game, or at least the best of the ones I've covered, with an overall score of 25 out of 30, with the runners-up tied for second place being Genshin Impact and Limbus Company with 24 out of 30. And in third is Honkai Star Rail with a total score of 22 out of 30. The lowest score was, unsurprisingly, Date A Live Spirit Echo, with a total of 10 out of 30. I honestly didn't expect there to be a clear winner for this video, as I knew that every gacha game had its own good and bad sides, and so I just assumed that there would simply be a tie for the highest place, but as it turns out, the story of Reverse 1999 was good enough to give it the only perfect 10 out of 10 score on this list, which pushed it up past the games tied for second place. I think the message to take from this video though is that each person's taste in games is different, and so maybe you would have scored each game differently, and that's okay. But I hope we can all get together and agree that there's no perfect gacha game. At least, not yet there isn't. There's a few games that I've heard about that are looking pretty good, so if a part 2 of this happens, they might be featured. So until a time comes that I'm called back into script purgatory to write that part 2 of this video, I shall say goodbye for now, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye now.